Welcome to Reverend Mike. Come in. I've got a book for you today, and you'd be dropping in here in the pastor's study. I'm just taking some downtime again. Existentialist ministry, it can be quite exhausting, but for some reason I like to come back here and unwind a bit, just relax, and just spend some downtime thinking about the universe. And of course we've got books, paper, just move out of the way, anything in your way. You can got some coffee over there. No, it's still hot. Water, things like that. Just whatever you want. Make yourself at home. I like to come back here. The existentialist mindset can be exhausting if it's not fascinating. It can be both at the same time. But anyway, I've got a book for you today since you were dropping in. We've been talking in our chats lately about railroads and trolleys and timetables, and more to the point about pre-computer means of organizing complex operations. Like back in the 1800s, there were no computers, certainly no modern computers that could keep track or help people keep track of all of these trains going this way and that over limited tracks. People had to come up with their own systems to do it. And today I've got some excerpts about the Apollo space program that I think might interest you. And I think they have a lot in common with railroads back in the day. And one big difference between railroads of the 1800s and the Apollo space program, the whole concept of, to quote Kennedy, land a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth. And he wanted to do that by the end of the decade, which was the 1960s. So the deadline was December 31st, 1969. This was an age of computers, though. They weren't home computers, certainly not cell phones, but electronic devices. Although in the 1960s, when the Apollo program was well underway, and there were space flights, and it captured the public attention, it captured the U.S. federal budget.
We have never specified long-range goals on an urgent time schedule or managed our resources and our time so as to ensure their fulfillment.
This is from President Kennedy's speech to Congress, May 25th, 1961. This is the speech in which he says, "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth." This is that speech. And the part of the speech that survives the filters of history most often is that line, the goal of landing a man on the moon. That's the part that winds up in retrospectives and documentaries most often. But the full speech, I'll play a little bit more of it here. The full speech is worth a listen. President Kennedy isn't just going to Congress to say we should land on the moon. He's making a business case for it. And when I was listening to this again, it seemed remarkable in this day and age. He makes a plain language business case. He goes into how the dollars will be spent, but he starts by saying, this is important. This is why it's important.
Recognizing the head start obtained by the Soviets with their large rocket engines, which gives them many months of lead time, and recognizing the likelihood that they will exploit this lead for some time to come in still more impressive successes, we nevertheless are required to make new efforts on our own. For while we cannot guarantee that we shall one day be first, we can guarantee that any failure to make this effort will make us last. We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful. But this is not merely a race. Space is open to us now, and our eagerness to share its meaning is not governed by the efforts of others. We go into space because whatever mankind must undertake, free men must fully share.
So Kennedy references astronaut Shepard. Alan Shepard had become the first American in space on May 5th, 1961, and here Kennedy is going to Congress 20 days later to make a speech and request funding to start a moon landing program. It's comical, but it's also bold.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. We propose to accelerate the development of the appropriate lunar spacecraft. We propose to develop alternate liquid and solid fuel boosters, much larger than any now being developed, until certain which is superior. We propose additional funds for other engine development and for unmanned exploration, explorations which are particularly important for one purpose which this nation will never overlook: the survival of the man who first makes this daring flight. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. If we make this judgment affirmatively, it will be an entire nation, for all of us must work to put him there.
One of the things I love about this speech, it is a mix of practical considerations. He is making a budget request of Congress, just like anybody going before a board of directors or before a supervisor asking for funding for a program. How much will it cost? What are you trying, before you get there, what are you trying to do? Why are you trying to do it? And then how much will it cost? How are you going to spend the money? Anybody who's even asked for an allowance generally has to give some justification and make an argument. He's doing it, but his argument isn't solely on the practical reasons. He is mixing in the excitement and the grandeur of the adventure. And then he returns to practical dollars and cents. But his speech, and this is often lost, I think, it's not just about the moon landing.
Secondly, an additional $23 million, together with $7 million already available, will accelerate development of the rover nuclear rocket. This gives promise of someday providing a means for even more exciting and ambitious exploration of space, perhaps beyond the moon, perhaps to the very end of the solar system itself. Third, an additional $50 million will make the most of our present leadership by accelerating the use of space satellites for worldwide communications. Fourth, an additional $75 million, of which $53 million is for the Weather Bureau, will help give us at the earliest possible time a satellite system for worldwide weather observation. Let it be clear, and this is a judgment which the members of the Congress must finally make. Let it be clear that I am asking the Congress and the country to accept a firm commitment to a new course of action, a course which will last for many years and carry very heavy costs, $531 million in fiscal 62, and an estimated $7 to $9 billion additional over the next 5 years. If we are to go only halfway or reduce our sights in the face of difficulty, in my judgment, it would be better not to go at all. Now, this is a choice which this country must make, and I'm confident that under the leadership of the space committees of the Congress and the appropriating committees that you will consider the matter carefully. It is a most important decision that we make as a nation. But all of you have lived through the last 4 years and have seen the significance of space and the adventures in space. And no one can predict with certainty what the ultimate meaning will be of mastery of space. I believe we should go to the moon, but I think every citizen of this country, as well as the members of the Congress, should consider the matter carefully in making their judgment, to which we've given attention over many weeks and months, because it is a heavy burden, and there is no sense in agreeing or desiring that the United States take an affirmative position in outer space unless we are prepared to do the work and bear the burdens to make it successful. If we are not, we should decide today on this year. This decision demands a major national commitment of scientific and technical manpower, materiel and facilities, and the possibility of their diversion from other important activities where they're already thinly spread. It means a degree of dedication, organization, and discipline which have not always characterized our research and development efforts. It means we cannot afford undue work stoppages, inflated costs of material or talent, wasteful interagency rivalries, or a high turnover of key personnel. New objectives and new money cannot solve these problems. They could, in fact, aggravate them further unless every scientist, every engineer, every serviceman, every technician, contractor, and civil servant gives his personal pledge that this nation will move forward with the full speed of freedom in the exciting adventure of space.
Again, it's that mix that is remarkable to me of the inspiration, the part that survives history's filter for documentaries, retrospectives, short YouTube clips, things like that. But he is making a business case. And I love this last part. He is showing so much respect to his audience here. He's acknowledging, just anybody who's been in a budget meeting knows if you have a worthwhile project that needs to be funded, that's terrific. But it is pulling away funds from other projects, potential projects. It might be pulling funds away from existing programs. And Kennedy acknowledges that, and he asks his audience to consider carefully. Well, I just love listening to that speech, but we were talking about computers. In the 1960s, human computers were still recognized. According to Wikipedia, the term computer goes back to the 1600s and means what it says, someone who computes. The reference given there is to the Oxford English Dictionary, and it references a literary reference from 1613. I remember reading something about human computers in relation to the Manhattan Project. Human computers, and women filled these roles, helped study numbers related to the formulas that were needed to calculate nuclear fission facts and formulas and so on. And the reference might have been in a book I read some time ago. It was a really good book called The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. He wrote another terrific book called Farm, focused on a Missouri farm family. The reference could have been from one of Richard Feynman's autobiographies. I remember reading those when I was in school. One of them is called Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. And in these biographies, he talked about his work on the Manhattan Project. At the time, he was a young physicist, and that became his whole career, physics. I don't know that he's too well known, but he would say things later. There's a video up on YouTube of a person asking him what seems to be a simple question, and Feynman is telling him, well, you're not asking the right, there's no way to answer that. And I think the reviews on that are mixed. He comes across as a jerk, but he's also a physicist who thinks very deep thoughts, and he contributed to making the atomic bomb. It could have been in that book. But anyway, by the 1950s and early 1960s, human computers were still used. There's a group photo on the Wikipedia article titled Computers for the Explorer 1 Trajectory. And it's a group of women standing outside. Explorer 1 was the first successful American satellite launched in the late 1950s. But the book I wanted to talk about is a history of Project Apollo. It's called Apollo Race to the Moon by Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox. And this is a history, in case you haven't come across it. There are a lot of books about Project Apollo. This one stands out. There are a lot of books about Project Apollo. This one stands out because the focus is on the people in mission control and other behind-the-scenes places. And there's one person in particular. I first read this book when I was working the night shift, and during my lunch break, I'd go back into the break area and just read through that book page after page. This was long before Kindle and so forth. But I want to get to the part that jumped out to me. So there's a character in the book, real person, Joe Shea, Joseph Francis Shea, born September 5th, 1925 in the Bronx. Born to a working-class Irish Catholic family there. His father was a mechanic on the New York City subway. And young Joe Shea, he enjoyed running, and he had dreams of being a professional track star. But he also did really well in school. He graduated from his Catholic high school at age 16. He did really well at the academic side as well. And at age 16, well, that was 1943, and the country was in a war, and he went into the Navy. And then through the program that he entered, he began studying at Dartmouth, and then MIT, and then the University of Michigan. He earned a doctorate at Michigan in the mid-1950s. And then he went to work for Bell Labs. And in 1956, Bell Labs was working on a project related to the Titan I intercontinental ballistic missile. And in 1956, Joe Shea was named systems engineer for radio guidance, the radio guidance project that Bell was working on. And Shea says in this Apollo history book that at the time he didn't even know what systems engineer meant. It was a new type of engineering, and it really had to do with how to manage large-scale projects. I first came across the term systems engineer when I was a kid reading through the Time Life Science Library books that my parents kept at home. And I was reading the one on engineering, and it would have been written in the 1960s, and it cast systems engineering in a sort of holistic a way. It would be an engineer who would take a look at how everything was integrated into a project, not solely focusing on one specific thing. I have indirectly known of an engineer who worked for a company, and what I was told was that his job was to improve the ball bearings that the company made, which, if you're into doing deep dives on things and sticking to subjects, it could be incredibly fascinating. But it's also a case where you're focused on just that one piece, and you need people like that. And systems engineering was more about how everything worked together. With Apollo, when that became a program, when Kennedy said the United States would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade and return him safely to Earth, which makes it much more complicated than just doing the first piece. This is true of any engineering project. There are trade-offs. I remember a columnist making the point some years ago that yes, it's possible to make an almost 100% safe car, but it's going to weigh so much that it'll barely move. You're not going to get to where you need to go fast enough. The doors are going to be impossible to open. And what the columnist was getting at is that with engineering, you have to make decisions that one way I think it shows up a lot is faster, better, cheaper, pick two. With the space program and Project Apollo, the whole point was getting to the moon, landing a person there, returning that person safely to Earth. And spacecraft have a lot of different parts that need to be balanced, and systems and decisions have to be made. The Apollo spacecraft that went to the moon, they're a certain shape, certain size, certain weight, and certain volume. And all of that is important to know because there's also a launch vehicle. The Saturn V rocket was used to send the Apollo spacecraft to the moon for the moon landings. And it was a massive machine. It generated enormous amounts of thrust, but there were limits to it, and there were limits on budget as well. So whatever the spacecraft was, it had to be within certain weight limits, or else the launch vehicle that was being developed wouldn't be able to lift it. And then there are safety considerations, say life control systems, say environmental systems that keep the astronauts alive during the journey to the moon and back. Well, how much reliability do you have? Do you have one system to scrub carbon dioxide from the air? Do you need two? Do you need three? What about the engines that you need to propel the spacecraft and allow it to maneuver? How much reliability do you back in? How big are those systems? What do they look like? Where do the exhaust nozzles go? Where do the batteries go? What about, how are you going to generate power? Are you going to use a radioactive thermoisotope generator? Or is that too dangerous? Or has the technology not been fully developed? Do you use fuel cells, which was a technology that was being developed at that time? How many do you need? Do you need backup? What if something goes wrong? And there are hundreds and thousands, not just of choices. It's not just as simple as saying, oh, I like that particular car. I'll get the entertainment system package and I want it in red. No, change that to white. I want the car to be white. It's not as simple as that. They were developing the spacecraft almost right before they launched it, and they had to make everything work together and fit together. And Joe Shea was brought into NASA in the early 1960s, and in October 1963, he was named manager of the Apollo spacecraft program office so that he could oversee these kinds of decisions. He had to bring an engineering mindset and discipline to the Apollo program and get the contractors and NASA working together to get the thing built. And what Murray and Cox described in their history that really jumped out at me when I read their book, and this was sometime in the late 1990s or early 2000s, was the management system he came up with to keep track of all of these hundreds, thousands of decisions and sub-assemblies and procedures too, because that factored into it as well. How are systems going to be used? That really did matter. And I'll talk about that in a second, because Joe Shea is probably most closely associated with a certain aspect of how the spaceship operated in space. But his job was to get the Apollo spacecraft ready, developed, designed, and built so that Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade, returning him safely to Earth, could be met. And I'll read a little bit from the book, because this is what stood out to me. And at the time I was dealing with my own version of how to balance a lot of competing goals and competing needs in the job that I had. So this is a chapter. I'm looking at a Kindle version, so I can't tell exactly where it is, but it's in the book. To get control of the program, Shea called in his new assistant, Tom Markley, and said to him that somehow they had to keep this thing on track. Quote, "Go out and fix me a management tool," he told Markley. Markley sent his men out to look at the major aerospace companies and their sophisticated management control centers. Then Markley himself went to visit what everyone said was the best of them all at the Martin Company. It was beautiful, Markley thought, sort of a management war room. He figured he would set something like that up for Joe, which would be a big relief for Markley because until he did, Shea was expecting him to know all the answers. Whenever Markley didn't know something, he had to live with Joe writing I won't say it, but Joe got on his case, the book makes clear, until he found out. So it was best if I got a good system going. Shea turned the Martin model down flat. Markley submitted a revised plan scaled down a little. Shea turned that down flat too. This is ridiculous, Markley thought, so he finally walked in and asked Shea what kind of management system he wanted. Shea told him. What he wanted, Markley said, was to get a notebook every Thursday night, and in it he wanted the entire program structured, meaning all the interfaces with Marshall Space Flight Center, everything going on with the command module, everything going on with the service module, everything going on with the SLA, everything going on with guidance and navigation, everything going on with the LEM, everything going on with the launch pad, the ground support equipment, with General Electric, everything Boeing was doing, everything everyone was doing. All this was to be in one notebook and should include not only what had been done in the last 7 days, but also comparisons against the programmed schedule and costs. And so Markley went away to produce the first edition of the loose-leaf notebook that he and his staff would prepare for Shea every week for the next 165 weeks. Each notebook ran to more than 100 pages and was on Shea's desk by close of business Thursday. Shea would get up at 4 a.m. Friday and start to annotate it, usually with technical comments and instructions, occasionally with remarks such as, "You've got to be kidding." He would work on the notebook intermittently from Friday morning through the weekend and return it to Markley on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, everyone in the ASPO network would have gotten his response from Shea. And the book goes on. I don't want to directly read too much of it. It really is worth going out and getting. It's available on Kindle. You can probably find it in a lot of places. Markley became the action officer, and it describes how he would take the notebook and he would go out and say, "Hey, we've got these questions," and you'd get the answers back, and the whole notebook became very marked up and so on. I'd love to see examples of that. I haven't been able to find them online, but there is the NASA Johnson Space Center Oral History Project, and it has a couple of interviews with Shea. He died in 1999, and these were conducted in 1998, the year before he died, by Michelle Kelly for the Oral History Project, Johnson Space Flight Center. And I'll read a little bit of the transcript. This is on the NASA website. Kelly, can you talk a little bit about the management reports and how you came up with the idea of communicating with all of the different offices within Johnson Space Center at the time you were developing? And Shea says, "Well, it seems to me it's obvious, it's mandatory. You can see the level of details, the kind of details that come out on a week-to-week basis, unless someone is in contact, first order, without any filter or any noise in the loop. You have to get direct information and understand where the direct information comes from." Now, it isn't that I didn't talk to these guys. If the problem looked like a big problem, then I would go talk to them. If it didn't look like a big problem, I'd just handle it by paper. Kelly, did you have any weekly meetings that went along with these reports? Shea, yes, there was a weekly meeting that was part of the program office. Anybody could sit in on it. That's how we ran the overall program, the dollars, the thoughts, the schedule, that type of thing. The interview gets into something that Shea got a lot of credit for, and it was really his sense of engineering, which is not about getting more systems in and more bells, whistles, knobs, blinking lights, and so forth. Engineering is really about how to accomplish things. It's a way of thinking about things. And one of the problems facing the Apollo designers was, well, what do you do when you have a spacecraft going from the Earth to the Moon and back? One side of that spacecraft is going to be exposed to sunlight, direct sunlight. it's going to get very hot. And the other side is going to get very cold because it's just radiating heat out into space. The sun isn't shining on that side. And it's a huge difference. And Shea talks about that in one of the interviews. He said, so the one example I would give you is we finally got equipment enough to test the heat shield material. The heat shield, if it stays in one attitude and the sun is beating on it from this side, the temperature goes to about plus 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The other side, which is now looking at outer space, which is cold, so it's radiating in outer space, and it goes to about minus 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So we finally got the ability to put the heat shield material in an electric shock tube, heat it up to 250 degrees, and then cool it down to see what would happen. The surface of the material started to crack and craze with the heat shield, and the heat shield guys came out to me and said, oh, we've got to start a whole new heat shield program. Estimate $60 million. We can't tell you the time. So I scratched my head and I said, how long does it take for the temperature to change from, let's say, ambient temperature to this minus 200 or plus 200? It's called a time constant. Oh, about 13 hours. I said, I'm abbreviating a little bit. I said, why does the spacecraft have to stay in any given attitude for 13 hours? It's a 3-day trip to the moon and 3 if you're back. But I can certainly change the attitude. You know, the idea of just slowly rotating the spacecraft 1 revolution per minute. Well, the medical people said, oh, the astronauts might get dizzy. The attitude control people said, well, we're not sure whether the attitude and control system can keep it stable. Well, I knew enough about control systems, and I knew that they could do that. So I sent them back to the drawing board, and we put the rotisserie mode in. So we slowly rotated going up to the moon and slowly rotated to come back again. The temperatures never varied more than about 40 degrees, plus or minus on the heat shield. That's what a program manager can do. Ask the fundamental question, why is the requirement what the requirement is? Does it make any sense, and how can you change it? Or how can you change it safely without any problem? In 2019, for the 50th anniversary, there was a documentary that came out. Beautiful documentary, Apollo 11. One of the things that I think makes it beautiful is there's no narrator. It's just using archival footage and modern graphics and modern music. But even the modern music is using equipment that was available at the time. So everything is back in 1969. And it illustrates the rotisserie mode. With rotisserie mode, I thought until that movie came out that the rotation, the direction of the spaceship was with the long axis pointed toward the moon, and it was rotating about the long axis. And the movie showed that it was rotating around the long axis, but the spacecraft was oriented so there's no up in space, but with the sun on one side and the plane that it was pointing away from the moon, away from the Earth, it was pointing in the other direction, up toward the north, where the North Pole would be. It's imperfect, but I didn't know that. I read a little bit at the time. I don't have a handy reference to it, but apparently the people working on the film did more and more research because it wasn't easy to find what direction was the spacecraft actually facing. Very good movie. Highly recommend it. So I also highly recommend that book. The history, it really is about the behind the scenes people. It's the ones working in mission control behind all those monitors. They're usually seen in documentary footage, but the book really explains what they were doing and who they were, how they operated, and so forth. Fascinating. I just called up. I thought it might be interesting since we're kind of going from one subject to the other. There's another website is full of NASA documents. NASA has a lot of them, but this is a book that's more focused on the Apollo guidance and navigation computer, and it has links to scanned documents from the Apollo program. And there's one here, what Joe Shea was working on and everybody in his team was working on, and all the contractors, a lot of people, was to build that Apollo spacecraft. So I called up the Apollo Operations Handbook. There are many different versions of it. This is for one of them, SM2A03 Block 2, parentheses 1. Like some of the railroad manuals I read, it really goes back to fundamentals. It starts there. So section 1.3, Apollo spacecraft configuration. The Block 2 spacecraft consists of a launch escape assembly, LEA, command module, CM, service module, SM, the spacecraft lunar module adapter, SLA, and the lunar module, LM. The reference system and stations are shown in Figure 1, 2. And then it goes on, launch escape assembly, 1.3.2 command module. The CM Figure 1.5, the spacecraft control center, contains necessary automatic and manual equipment to control and monitor the spacecraft systems. It also contains the required equipment for safety and comfort of the flight crew. The module is an irregularly shaped primary structure encompassed by 3 heat shields coated with ablative material and joined or fastened to the primary structure, forming a truncated conic structure. The CM consists of a forward compartment, a crew compartment, and an aft compartment for equipment and a crew. See Figure 1.6. The command module is conical shaped, 11 feet 1.5 inches long, and 12 feet 6.5 inches in diameter without the ablative material. The ablative material is non-symmetrical and adds approximately 4 inches to the height and 5 inches to the diameter. And it keeps going on. 1.3.2.1 forward compartment. The forward compartment, Figure 1.6, is the area outside the forward access tunnel, forward of the crew compartment, forward bulkhead, and covered by the forward heat shield. 4 90-degree segments around the perimeter of the tunnel contain the recovery equipment, 2 negative pitch reaction control system engines, and the forward heat shield release mechanism. Most of the equipment is in the forward compartment. Most of the equipment in the forward compartment consists of earth landing, parentheses, recovery system, ELS components. And then it gets into the diagrams. And I'm just scrolling down here with the mouse wheel. Aft compartment describes that. When I was a kid, I used to see some of these diagrams in books, but never to this level of detail. This is the one that the crews would have used and people working on it. Goes in the crew compartment. It's all the culmination of all that work that Joe Shea and his team did. This is the result of all those hundreds, thousands of decisions, problems, problem solving, available techniques, materials. It all culminates in this. And this itself is just a vehicle. It's not the answer to Kennedy's direction to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth. This is itself just one vital component of that. This is the vehicle. This is the ship that's going to get him there. It's not even the one that's going to land on the moon. This is all about the command module. And I'm just scrolling in quite a bit. Just drop in here. The crew hatch should not be closed from the outside of the CM with a handle control knob in the latch position, view G. Always set the pull control knob in the neutral or unlatched position, located around the outer periphery or 15 mechanically actuated latches that engage the inner structure adapter. And we can go on and on. Forward access hatch, crew stations. Here's a definition of a spacesuit to talk about fundamentals. 1.3.2.7.1 Spacesuit. The spacesuit acts as a flexible environmental chamber in which the crewman is supplied a flow of pressurized oxygen. It includes undergarments, ventilation ducts, and the communication system. There are many accessories such as the oxygen hose, communication cables, couplings, screen caps, connector plugs, and maintenance kits. If you've ever seen a cutaway drawing of the Apollo spacecraft, this is far more detailed. Well, thank you for coming by. It was good to see you again. Music is Frost Waltz, Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. http://creativecommons.org/licenses/by/4.0/. Until next time.